Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. I've been a fan of progressive rock for the last 50 years or so, and there have been many times over the years where people who are being exposed to the genre for the first time have taken me aside and said, "This is really interesting stuff, but where did it all come from? Where did prog rock get its start?" There are people out there who think that the genre started with a big bang in October of 1969 with the release of a single album, King Crimson's debut in the Court of the Crimson King. But it wasn't the start of prog rock per se. There were quite a few things that happened in the 1960s, both artistically and in the music business, that helped prog rock to emerge in the manner that we now know it. In this series, I'm going to go over a bit of that history, and I'll discuss 25 albums that are very significant to the emergence of prog rock. In my opinion, prog rock might have become a very different animal from the one we've come to know and love had these albums not been created over the course of the years 1965 through 1969. Just a quick recap of the criteria that we used to select the albums that comprise the 25 proto-prog albums that shaped prog rock. First off, we selected albums based on their influence. It could be based on the artist's innovation, based on cultural influence, or the use of technology. We restricted ourselves to a single entry per artist on the list in order to promote diversity of the music of the time and to make sure that certain artists that had tremendous commercial appeal at the time didn't dominate the list. Today's entry is from May of 1966. It's the Beach Boys album, Pet Sounds. In late 1965, when Pet Sounds was first conceived by its producer, Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys were arguably America's most successful rock and roll band. Other than for a few of the holdovers from the Phil Spector era in the early part of the decade, and for perhaps the vocal group The Four Seasons, the Beach Boys didn't really have any American competition. There was, of course, competition from the various British invasion bands. The Beatles, of course, hit the world by storm in 1964. The Rolling Stones came soon after and really made their mark starting in 1965. Eric Burdon and the Animals arrived on American shores in late 1964, and they continued their success for several years as well. But the Beach Boys were pretty special. They had been, by the time of the release of Pet Sounds, in the public eye for about 5 years. They basically grew up in public. When Pet Sounds was released in early 1966, Brian Wilson was not yet 24 years old. But there is no doubt that his genius was on display for this album. Brian Wilson, along with his songwriting partner, Tony Asher, constructed a wonderful piece of music that sadly didn't really get the support of the Beach Boys record company, capital EMI Records. The story behind this is an interesting one in that it shows how single-minded record company executives in the 1960s could be. Brian Wilson was a gifted songwriter, and more to the point, he not only could write consistently good songs, but he could think outside of the rock and roll genre. As early as the early portion of 1965, Wilson was experimenting with concept-style albums. The album The Beach Boys Today is a case in point. The Beach Boys Today is largely an album recorded not by the Beach Boys playing behind their main vocalists, Mike Love and Brian Wilson, but it was one of the first albums that was self-produced by a band member that featured members of the Los Angeles session musicians cadre that would come to be known as the Wrecking Crew. The Beach Boys were adequate musicians on stage, but on the Beach Boys today, Brian Wilson began making use of players who were, at the time, at a very different level. Players like, for example, guitarist Glenn Campbell, bassist Carol Kaye, and drummer Hal Blaine. The Beach Boys today was a stellar album. It was very heavily influenced by the work of Brian Wilson's idol, Phil Spector, and to a lesser degree by the songwriters Burt Bacharach and Hal David. The songs that were most popular from the Beach Boys today, Help Me Rhonda and Please Let Me Wonder, were a far cry from the songs about surf and partying and girls that the Beach Boys were famous for in the early 60s. And that was something that Capitol EMI Records didn't particularly like. They wanted the Beach Boys to continue with the formula that they felt worked. And they began putting pressure on the Beach Boys and on Wilson as the major creative force in the band to go back to basics. And Wilson did for their next two albums. The albums Summer Days and Summer Nights and Beach Boys Party, both also released in 1965, were somewhat simpler in their content, and they continued the string of hit singles. Brian Wilson had other ideas at this point, though. Like the Beach Boys, the Beatles were also signed in the United States to Capitol EMI Records. And in late 1965, by virtue of their common label association, Brian Wilson was able to get his hands on an early copy of the Beatles' late 1965 album, Rubber Soul, the American version, which has a decided bent towards folk rock with occasional dabs of orchestration added by the Beatles' producer George Martin, for good measure. Upon hearing Rubber Soul, Brian Wilson made a conscious decision that he wanted to again abandon the themes of surf and sex and parties and go forward with a semi-autobiographical concept album about growing up and dealing with early adulthood. Wilson and Tony Asher did a wonderful job of this. Pet Sounds is considered to be a modern classic. Wilson didn't particularly care if Capitol EMI didn't get behind it. He was willing to release it as a Brian Wilson solo album in order to take pressure off the band. And in fact, the first single from the album, Caroline No, was released under Wilson's own name initially. Ultimately, fans were demanding a new Beach Boys album in early 1966. And so, when Pet Sounds was ultimately released in May of 1966, the singles that Capitol subsequently released from the album, Wouldn't It Be Nice and Sloop John B, were released under the Beach Boys name. The singles, while they were radio standards during the summer of 1966, again failed to impress the executives at Capitol in a substantial way from a commercial perspective. Their answer to Pet Sounds was, in the summer of 1966, to release the first Beach Boys Greatest Hits compilation, Best of the Beach Boys Volume 1, which Brian Wilson took as something of a slap in the face. Wilson would continue his experimentation with various musical forms. The Beach Boys' next single, following the group of singles from Pet Sounds, was Good Vibrations, which is a Stone classic containing wonderful orchestration, great music from the members of the Wrecking Crew, great vocals from the Beach Boys themselves, and the experimental use of the theremin, with the idea being that Good Vibrations would be the lead-in single for a full album that would again follow a more concept-oriented path, that album being the legendary Smile, which unfortunately never came to fruition for various reasons, the most notable being Brian Wilson's nervous breakdown in 1967. A great album that unfortunately the record company didn't see the value of at the time. So why is Pet Sounds important to the development of progressive rock? Two reasons. The first reason, and this is true not just for prog rock, but for other genres of pop music that emerged in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, is that it's a self-produced piece of work. Most rock bands were not allowed to participate directly in production of their material in the early and middle 1960s. Not even the Beatles produced themselves. That work was very closely held for quite some time by George Martin, although the Beatles would, in the later 60s, begin to collaborate more actively with Martin and with his proteges at Abbey Road Studios. Other bands generally were expected to work with producers who were assigned by their record labels, or in some cases with producers who were best known as producers who could sell product based on their names. People like Phil Spector and Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, for example, fall into this category. Brian Wilson's being allowed to produce the Beach Boys, especially at such an early age, was definitely a vote of confidence by capital EMI that Wilson was a tremendous creative force and that he would be capable of delivering significant and commercial product for release to the public. As I mentioned, that support wasn't always unwavering. They did want Wilson to try and stick with the formula, and they didn't particularly support the Beach Boys once they started getting away from the formula. The Beach Boys, following Brian Wilson's breakdown, did not have any significant hits at Capitol. It wouldn't be until they made the move to Warner Brothers Reprise Records in 1970 that they would see their records being played regularly on the progressive rock radio format and getting attention from the public again. But for Brian Wilson to be entrusted by a major record label with creating product at the tender age of 22, which is when Wilson first began running sessions with the Wrecking Crew, is quite notable. It opened the door for record labels to allow greater use of independent producers and ultimately for bands to more regularly produce themselves. The second reason behind Pet Sounds' importance is its use of instrumentation. With Pet Sounds, and really in fact going back to the Beach Boys' earlier The Beach Boys Today album, Wilson began incorporating much more variety in the backing music that was used for his songs. Full orchestration was used often. As I mentioned, the professional musicians of the Wrecking Crew were made use of tremendously. By virtue of recording in Los Angeles, Wilson had access not only to the Wrecking Crew, but to two of the finest studios at the time for creating pop music. One, Gold Star Studios, was Phil Spector's favorite studio. Gold Star's primary engineer, Larry Levine, was very well versed with Phil Spector's wall of sound techniques, and he put those to work on some of the Beach Boys songs. By virtue of recording at Capitol, Brian Wilson also had access to their fabled in-house studio, which had a wonderful natural reverb, and the Beach Boys, being a great vocal group, could take advantage of that as well. So between the advanced production techniques that Wilson could pursue, as well as the great musicians and the variety of instrumentation that he could apply to his music, he was able to do some things that were very remarkable for 1966. Pet Sounds is a terrific record. It's, by most definitions, not a progressive rock record, but there are a lot of things that probably couldn't have happened in progressive rock the way they did if Pet Sounds hadn't come first. Well, there you have it. We'll be back soon to discuss the next artist on the list. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts or questions about this particular show, please feel free to share them in the comments. And please feel free to subscribe and keep track of upcoming shows as we go forward. Thanks very much. Take care.